Splendid, he said to himself as the savage started his astonishing performance. Splendid. He kept his telescopic cameras carefully aimed, glued to their moving objective, clapped on a higher power to get a close up of the frantic and distorted face. Admirable. Switched over for half a minute to slow motion, an exquisitely comical effect. He promised himself, listened in, meanwhile, to the blows, the groans, the wild and raving words that were being recorded on the soundtrack at the edge of his film, tried the effect of a little amplification. Yes, that was decidedly better, was delighted to hear, in a momentary lull, the shrill singing of a lark, wished the savage would turn round so that he could get a good close up of the blood on his back. And almost instantly, what astonishing luck, the accommodating fellow did turn round, and he was able to take a perfect close up. Well, that was grand, he said to himself when it was all over. Really grand. He mopped his face. When they had put in the Feely effects at the studio, it would be a wonderful film, almost as good, thought Darwin Bonaparte, as the Sperm Whale's Love Life, and that, by Ford, was saying a good deal. 12 days later, the Savage of Surrey had been released and could be seen, heard, and felt in every first-class Feely palace in Western Europe. The effect of Darwin Bonaparte's film was immediate and enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its release, John's rustic solitude was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great swarm of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging, too, in his own mind, laboriously turning up the substance of his thought, death, and he drove in his spade once and again, and yet again, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. A convincing thunder rumbled through the words. He lifted another spadeful of earth. Why had Linda died? Why had she been allowed to become gradually less than human? And at last, he shuddered, a good kissing carrion. He planted his foot on his spade and stamped it fiercely into the tough ground. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Thunder again, words that proclaimed themselves true. Truer, somehow, than truth itself. And yet, that same Gloucester had called them ever gentle gods. Besides, thy best of rest is sleep, and that thou oft provokest, yet grossly fearest thy death, which is no more than sleep. Sleep, perchance, to dream. His spade struck against a stone. He stopped to pick it up, for in that sleep of death, what dreams? A humming overhead had become a roar, and suddenly he was in shadow. There was something between the sun and him. He looked up, startled from the digging, from his thoughts, looked up in a dazzled bewilderment, his mind still wandering in that other world of truer than truth, still focused on the immensities of death and deity, looked up and saw, close above him, the swarm of hovering machines. Like locusts they came, hung poised, descended all round him on the heather, and from out of the bellies of these giant grasshoppers stepped men in white viscous flannels, women, for the weather was hot, in acetate shantung pajamas or velveteen shorts, and sleeveless, half unzipped singlets. One couple from each. In a few minutes there were dozens of them, standing in a wide circle round the lighthouse, staring, laughing, clicking their cameras, throwing, as to an ape, peanuts, packets of sex hormone chewing gum, panglandular petites beerus, in every moment, for across the Hog's Back the stream of traffic now flowed unceasingly. Their numbers increased, as in a nightmare. The dozens became scores, the scores hundreds. The savage had retreated towards cover, and now, in the posture of an animal at bay, stood with his back to the wall of the lighthouse, staring from face to face in speechless horror, like a man out of his senses. From this stupor he was aroused to a more immediate sense of reality by the impact on his cheek of a well-aimed packet of chewing gum, a shock of startling pain, and he was broad awake and fiercely angry. "Go away!" he shouted. The ape had spoken. There was a burst of laughter and hand-clapping. "Good old savage! Hurrah! Hurrah!" And through the babble he heard cries of "Whip! Whip! The whip!" Acting on the word's suggestion, he seized the bunch of knotted cords from its tail behind the door and shook it at his tormentors. There was a yell of ironical applause. Menacingly, he advanced towards them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point, then stiffened again, stood firm. The consciousness of being an overwhelming force had given these sightseers a courage which the savage had not expected of them. Taken aback, he halted and looked round. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was an almost plaintive note in his anger. "Have a few magnesium salted almonds," said the man, who, if the savage were to advance, would be the first to be attacked. He held out a packet. "They're really very good, you know," he added, with a rather nervous smile of propitiation. "And the magnesium salts will help to keep you young." The savage ignored his offer. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one grinning face to another. "What do you want with me?" "The whip," answered 100 voices confusedly. "Do the whipping stunt. Let's see that whipping stunt." Then in unison, and on a slow, heavy rhythm, "We want the whip," shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip." Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated, parrot fashion, again and again, with an ever-growing volume of sound, until, by the seventh or eighth reiteration, no other word was being spoken. "We want the whip." They were all crying together, and intoxicated by the noise, the unanimity, unanimity, the sense of rhythmical atonement. They might, it seemed, have gone on for hours, almost indefinitely, but at about 25th repetition the proceedings were startlingly interrupted. Yet another helicopter had arrived from across the Hog's Back, hung poised above the crowd, then dropped within a few yards of where the savage was standing, in the open space between the line of sightseers and the lighthouse. The roar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground and the engines were turned off, "We want the whip! We want the whip!" broke out again in same loud, insistent monotone. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped first a fair and ruddy-faced young man, then, in green velveteen shorts, white shirt, and jockey cap, a young woman.